Mr. Patrick Guillory, thank you so much for being with us. It's such an honor to meet with you finally and have you with us. And thanks so much for sharing with us the documents about your experience here. So you were born in San Francisco.
Yes.
And your parents were born in southern Louisiana.
Yes.
Could you please tell us about your childhood memories and your education journeys, and what was it like growing up in the Bay Area during those years?
Growing up in the Bay Area was unique, a place where my parents thought that civil rights and civil freedoms were more readily available in California than they were in Louisiana. And they moved from Louisiana, like many people of color, to get away from discrimination, racism, and Jim Crow. And Jim Crow were the laws that kept our people down, that kept the society segregated, that kept most people of color very poor.
Thank you. In terms of your educational experience, you attended high schools both in Santa Cruz and San Francisco.
Yes.
Right? And then you went to City College of San Francisco for an associate in arts.
Right.
It was an interesting time with the beginning of the free speech and ethnic awareness movement, as you mentioned. At that time, you chose SF State for work, right?
Yes.
How did you find the school then?
Well, I wanted to go to San Francisco State because of its political activity, and because I lived in San Francisco. I was very close, and I was able to, because of my grade point average, to be admitted to San Francisco State. In my family, I was the first generation to go to college. In fact, I may have been the first generation to go to high school. Being from Louisiana, my dad went to the third grade. My mom went to a Catholic school, and I think she did graduate from high school.
So you went to SF State to pursue your bachelor's degree?
My bachelor's degree I received in psychology, which I must say I wasn't completely motivated or clear-minded about having psychology as a bachelor's degree, because after getting the degree, I wasn't quite sure what I knew in psychology. I went on to work at the phone company, went back to school in graduate school here at San Francisco State in the Department of Social Work. My first year in the social work department, I did an internship at San Francisco General Hospital in psychiatric social work. I received an F in my first semester because some of my patients that I was assigned to were suffering from social ills, racism, and personal violence. So when I evaluated them, I used social constructs, racism, and things like that as a reason why they were in a mental health situation. And I didn't use psychological terms like psychotic or neurotic or manic depressive. And by not using those terms, my supervisor at General Hospital failed me because I didn't use psychological terms. The next semester, I incorporated a few psychological terms into my evaluations, and I passed.
So after that experience, you stayed on at SF State, and you were offered a job?
Yes, after graduating from the social work department. By the way, we had a strike in the social work department after the San Francisco State strike. It was about 3 or 4 years later. And we struck basically for the same reasons that the entire school struck, which was for better classes, racial equity, students of color and more faculty of color. And so, yeah, it was an interesting 2 years in the Department of Social Work here at San Francisco State.
So during the early years at SF State, you worked with Jim Mirabayachi, right? The first
Yes.
dean of ethnic studies, on both college growth and some of the challenges that you encountered, particularly after the strike, right? What were some of the major trials in the college and that the college had grappled with?
I would say, from what I knew in the American Indian Studies, organization and follow through with academic classes was very difficult to put together. Because there had not been an ethnic studies before, because there was never any American Indian Studies before, because there weren't any American Indian classes, it was difficult to put them together. Al Miller, Don Patterson, Phil Tingley, and some of the original members of the American Indian Studies Department worked tirelessly to put classes formats together that were meaningful to students and also were acceptable to the administration. At that time, San Francisco State administration was very right-wing, you might say, or very conservative about allowing any new social ideas, psychological ideas, or activities like that.
If I can take you a little bit back to the years before joining the college, the creation of the college, were you part of the strike, and what was your role in that?
Well, I guess from the beginning, I was an observer of the strike and a supporter of it. I wasn't active in it because I was in high school. When I first arrived, in fact, my first day at San Francisco State College, when I came to register, there was an unauthorized rally going on that day, right near the cafeteria in the common area. And there were hundreds of students there. As I walked to the administration office to turn in my application, I looked and saw students running past me as fast as they could. And then I looked behind them, and there were police officers in riot gear and batons chasing them, ready to beat them. So without knowing what to do, except when I saw the police officers coming at me with clubs, I did what the other students did that turned around and ran. I turned around and ran with them away from the cops toward Uniprocera Avenue. And yeah, I avoided getting hit with a baton. Some of the other students weren't so lucky. So that was my initial experience at San Francisco State.
And how did you later become familiar with the general situation of the strike?
Well, we had rallies regularly near the cafeteria, and the strike happened, and so there were no classes for a while. And then it seemed like, because I wasn't involved in I was not involved in negotiating, but the result of the strike was the creation of the Department of Ethnic Studies and the School of Ethnic Studies, the College of Ethnic Studies. And unlike most other universities at the time that allowed for ethnic studies classes, they didn't allow for a whole department or a college within the university to be specifically for ethnic studies. So San Francisco State was unique because it had a whole college, a whole school with different departments within the School of Ethnic Studies. So that we felt was empowering, gave us more independence, and gave us more ability to put forward the kind of classes and vision that we saw.
Mm-hmm. So how would you describe the other department's take or view toward the creation of a specific College of Ethnic Studies? Supportive, resentment? I
think there was both. Support from some of the faculty members, and in fact, San Francisco State had the American Federation of Teachers was a big player in the the university, a lot of the college professors belonged to the American Federation of Teachers Union. The union supported the student strike, and it helped it be very successful in shutting the school down. When the strike was over, however, the administration did what happened in politics in the U.S. There was a backtracking, a right-wing backtracking of progressive ideas. And what happened, the administration fired 1,500 teachers from San Francisco State. They weren't tenured, they were lecturers, instructors, but they were very much part of the AFT and very much a part of the strike. The administration said no, the only way they could get rid of them is to not rehire them because they weren't tenured. And as a result, about 1,500 very good teachers, professors did not come back. And it really took the wind out of the student strike in many ways because there weren't professors there to support us and to lead rallies and marches and stuff.
So the administration cracked down on those 1,500 instructors, non-tenured instructors, plus there were police presence on campus for an entire semester.
Yes, without the teachers, when we went back to class, there was like a vacuum of good, progressive thinking, teaching instructors. And when we went back to school, the San Francisco police had on every door to every building 2 cops in full riot gear standing on either side of the door, so that when you walked into class, into the building, you would be walking past 2 guards that made you feel like you were walking into a prison, because if anything happened, they were there ready to come in and use their billy clubs on you. So yeah, for every day for a semester, walking into class and seeing police officers at the door on either side made you feel.
Which semester? What year?
That was.
Was that the fall of '69? Because you had
just
entered. So you kind of entered after kind of that, that agreement that the students had with the. So you entered that fall. So
yes.
The fall, the police presence was still there,
yes.
Even though technically the strike had been over.
Exactly.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Right. So yeah, what it did was, not only were the teachers gone, but having the police force on campus, it was like an armed camp. And
wow.
We weren't prisoners, but we had the feeling that if we got out of line, we'd wind up in jail or worse, beat by the police.
Wow, that's wild, because we had never heard that story, that even in fall of '69, that this was kind of going on.
Yeah.
That even there was resolve to the student demands, but there was still that police presence. Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
So in terms of the dynamics of the dynamics between the different groups, the different departments, how would you describe the relationships between the newly created entities within the college?
I think for the most part there was resistance from the administration and from the different departments. I guess nobody likes to have their authority taken from them, or having another perspective tell them that perhaps what they're thinking is wrong, or at least incomplete, because they didn't have the full story. And ethnic studies brought to the university a wider understanding of what has happened to people of color, the history of the U.S. in terms of its violence against people of color, against Native Americans, against African Americans, against anyone who wasn't white. And so I think that was a time when the consciousness of the true history of the country started to emerge. Today it's out in full force, but some people are calling it critical race theory, like it's something that's not true, or it's something that they shouldn't understand because it doesn't jive with their previous understanding of what America stands for. And we understand now that America stands for violence against people of color, against people who want social and civil rights. They didn't tell us as kids that my own people, Native Americans, were slaughtered. We were told that America was discovered by Columbus, and there was nobody here except maybe a few Indians, not the millions that we know that were here now. So yeah, the change of perspective from the old American white history to the new people of color true history clashed with the old, and as a result, there was a lot of resistance by the old administration.
So can I ask a question? So you arrived here fall 1969. What organizations did you get involved with?
Say again?
What organizations did you, what student organizations?
I got involved with American Indian Movement,
Okay.
with the nonviolent the SNCC,
SNCC,
with the general body of students at San Francisco State that supported the strike and followed the leaders. And when they told us to rally, they told us to march, they told us to not go to class. So yeah, I was in my early 20s, and I felt the energy, the commitment, the anger, and the drive for a change, because as we went to school, we realized that we were not getting the full truth, and that's what we want, and still want.
Was there a connection between the strike and the Alcatraz movement?
The Alcatraz?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there a connection between the two?
Right. Many students from San Francisco State went to Alcatraz, Indians, during the occupation. And there were actually students who would hire boats and go out there and bring food and come back and talk about what they saw. And there, some families went to the island and stayed there. They lived there. They raised their kids there. They were there for over a year. And it was a great experience. We went over to visit them. I never lived over there with them, but I knew a lot of people who did live over there. I think Richard Oakes was one of the first main leaders who talked to me and the other folks about going to Alcatraz. And at the time, we thought Alcatraz would be returned to Native Americans because there was a treaty that said unused federal land that was unoccupied would revert back to Native American tribes. So that's why we went to Alcatraz and claimed it as our own, because it was unoccupied. The prison had been closed, and it was an unoccupied piece of property that originally was Native American land. Anyway.
And that led to, with the creation of the College of Ethnic Studies, new Department for American Indian Studies as well was founded. Mm-hmm. And who founded that, and what was the sort of the mission or the goal of the department?
Well, when as a student, I took classes in Indian Studies, and wound up, one of the original professors was Dr. Barney Honer. He was a Lakota from Standing Rock. And the interesting thing about Barney was he was a veterinarian. Standing Rock Sioux, Native American, grew up on the reservation. He was a veterinarian, and he told us, and I sang with Barney in his singing drum group, and he would tell us stories in between songs. And as it turns out, he's a Native American, and he was the very first veterinarian Native American in the whole United States. And we thought, wait a minute, this guy, aren't Indians one with the animals? Aren't they speakers and individuals who can communicate, live with, enjoy, and to take the best of their cohort mammals, like buffalo, like eagles. And so when he told us that he was the first American Indian vet, we all said, how can that even be? But it's true. He graduated from veterinary school. I was in Boston, University of Boston, in about 1950, I think. So that was he was the very first known Native American who was given the privilege and the esteem that so many other non-Indian veterinarians had gotten before him. And he probably knew a lot more about animals than PhD veterinarians before he even went to medical school.
So he was the founder?
Well, he wasn't the founder of Indian Studies. I think the first director was Don Patterson, and Al Miller was his vice chair, and they were both from Oklahoma. Phil Tingley, a great gay Native American, was one of the first openly gay Indians in the administration in San Francisco State, and he, spread out and became known in the Indian community and the non-Indian community as a gay leader in San Francisco, because during the 70s and 80s, when the gay awareness movement began, San Francisco was a center for the American gay movement. And in fact, in the 70s and 80s, thousands of people around the country who were gay and not gay moved to San Francisco to be involved in the activities of the gay movement in San Francisco. And I worked at the American Indian Center in the 1970s and 80s, and I met literally hundreds of people from around the country, Indians, who moved to San Francisco because they were gay. They were not welcome either in their tribe, in their community, or even in their family, so they came here. And they found the community that they could be with, be in love with, and who loved them and accepted them. So San Francisco, of course, became known as a gay center for gay people around the world. And American Indians were definitely involved.
What were the very first few years of the department like? I mean, what courses did you teach? What kind of professors did you have? And the interactions the department had with the college, other departments as well?
You mean after?
Yeah, when you got in and you started working for American Indian Studies, right?
Well, I think it was a good relationship between Indian Studies and at least the social studies departments, the humanities department, the history department. There may have been historians, professors, and humanitarian professors who didn't believe that minorities, people of color, were up to the same intellectual standards as non-Indians and as white people. But it came to be shown that we people of color are just as smart, can study just as much, can get just as good grades, and perform and be active and contribute to the community just as much, if not more, than non-people of color, than European Americans, I should say.
What classes did you teach?
I taught a class that hadn't been taught before. Because I'm an attorney and studied law, I taught a class about American Indian legal history in the U.S. And of course, although American Indians comprise of less than 5% of the total population, it's probably around 2 or 3%, there is a body of Indian law that's enormous because of all the interactions between the U.S. government and Indian tribes. So, yes, there was a whole body of books, of cases that we studied, that I taught, that explained how the relationship between the United States and Indian people first began. And of course, the U.S. considers itself to be the great white father of the Indian tribes. So that meant from the very beginning that Indians were subservient to the non-Indians because they were considered non-civilized, non-Christian, non-white. The things you don't want to be in a white, violent country, which America has never admitted to being as violent as it really is, unless you go to today or even the last month in this history and see all the violence that has taken place, all the mass killings, the mass shootings, and the things that are taking place now that a lot of people consider to be out of the ordinary, extraordinary, horribly bad, but it really is in line with the history of the U.S. because the first thing that happened here was the settlers came over, they displaced the Native Americans, killed them, started the things like the Trail of Tears, and did everything they could to annihilate Native Americans. And in the American way, it was okay because Indians were non-white, non-Christian, and non-civilized to them. So we were basically subhuman, as were the slaves, as were the people of Asian descent that they brought over to work in the railroads. And of course, the native people south of the U.S. border are considered invaders, or they're non-citizens, they're aliens. But in fact, the Rio Grande River separates the U.S. and Mexico, and most Mexican people, as we know, may not belong to an Indian tribe, but if you look at them, you can tell they're Indian. They're straight hair, they're dark skinned, there's not much hair on the rest of their body. They look like Indians, but to American government under people like Trump, they're aliens. So, and we know they're not. So the fact that one river is used to separate Native people from one side from Native people on the other is just a fallacy. Because all that border is, all that is a river. To a Native American who crosses back and forth that river every day in their life, hundreds of times, it's not a border, it's just a river.
I want to shift gears and talk about your experience with students and primarily with Wilma McKellar. You were the advisor, you were her Education Opportunity Program advisor, or the EUP, which provides admission, academic, and financial support services to historically underserved students throughout California. Can you take us back to that initial interaction with Wilma and your effort to bring her to SF State?
Well, of course, Wilma Mankiller today, I think, is well known by most people. She was a graduate of San Francisco State. She grew up in San Francisco, and as you know, she wound up being the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, and they put her picture on a U.S. quarter.
Right.
She was like most students here at San Francisco State. I think she lived in student housing. There was a student housing buildings here, which they've torn down since then, but I think she lived in student housing with one of her kids. And she was married and living there. And with a name like Mankiller, it was, people used to just look at her really weird and say, how did you get that last name? And did you make that up? Why are you named that? And as it turns out, the name Mankiller comes from one of her ancestors who was a great warrior who killed in battle white people or white men. And I don't know if it's true, but there was a rumor, and it may have been started by her, that Man Killer was really a shortened version of her full name. And going back to her grandfather and great-grandfather, she said, I think she's the one that told me that the long version of the name Man Killer is really 6 White Man Killer. So that's the long version of her name, Man Killer. So if you go all the way back, yeah, that it's a pretty interesting long version of her name, 6 White Man Killer.
So you were her advisor.
Yes.
And so, what kind of activities was she involved in on campus, and what kind of work did she do? Was her presence back then sort of empowering to Native students on campus?
It was, although I think the campus did that to her. I think the campus was empowering to her in a way that helped her formulate her political ideas about independence and sovereignty, which she took back to Oklahoma when she moved back there and wound up being elected as a principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. So it felt to me, in knowing Wilma, that her knowledge and her spirit and her drive was formulated here at San Francisco State. She took it back to the Cherokee Nation, she used it, and she helped organize the Cherokee Nation and did great things with them.
Mm-hmm. So this was back in the 1980s?
The 1970s.
70s.
60s and 70s.
And
yeah.
did she ever come back to campus to speak? And
Yeah, she came back and she would give speeches to students and different venues in different colleges in the Bay Area, because she would, after she became chief, she became well known and came back and visited us and continued to be an inspiration to Native Americans.
in signing a copy for autobiography, Man Killer, Chief of Her People, Wilma thanked you for, quote, helping many Native people trust their own thinking, end of quote. Where did that recognition come from? What does
That
it mean to
is
you?
an interesting thing, because when I was a kid, being a non-white kid and living in a mostly white situation, my father would tell me, it doesn't matter what people think of who you are. It doesn't matter what they think about your complexion or your dark skin. He said, no matter what anybody tells you, you think for yourself. Don't let anybody tell you how to think. You make up your own mind. And when Wilma wrote that to me in the book, it just brought me back to what my dad told me. And the fact that she left San Francisco State feeling like she was empowered because she used her own will and her own soul to create her own thinking and her own ideas was really great for her, for her tribe, and I think it shows what a good school San Francisco State was.
Yeah, when I read that, it was a really powerful statement to me.
And she's famous for making good statements. There's a bunch of them that she's made in her time as chief that still live on to this day.
Other question?
Well, see,
Yes.
69 is also the occupation of Alcatraz happens.
Yes.
Can you talk about where you were at when you heard and were, I know you said you did make trips out there, but were you what were you feeling and experiencing? Because you were taking classes in American Indian Studies, you were arriving into your own consciousness. So
At the time, as a Native American, we felt that we were going to regain sovereignty and that we were going to win Alcatraz back for Native Americans, which we did. During the time we were there, there was support from around the country, students, people coming and going. So we felt that we were going to actually win. And there were government legislators who said, well, yeah, we're going to turn this over and turn it into a Native American university, Alcatraz.
Wow.
It didn't happen. You know, the conservative forces and racist forces didn't allow that, and now it's just a place where you could visit. The buildings are still there, and it never turned into a Native American university, which would have been great. Yeah, so that, in the American Indian movement, in my day, there were struggles against the U.S. government for many different reasons. And it seems like the government came down on Indian tribes more than it did on other, even minorities, because Indians have always been considered the enemy of the U.S. government when they came over. And it was the Department of War that handled all affairs with Native Americans until the 1900s. And in fact, this is an interesting, I don't want to say it's a fun fact, but American Indians, we call them American Indians, of course India's way over there, were the first people in the United States for many thousands of years. I'm losing my train of thought here, but as Indians, after the takeover of Wounded Knee and after the struggles in Indian country, there were armed battles between Indians and the FBI. And there was one Native American, Leonard Peltier, who was involved in the struggle against the FBI. He was charged and convicted of killing 2 FBI men. There's big evidence, strong evidence that he didn't do it, but he was framed by the FBI and is serving now almost 50 years in jail. So from the very beginning of the struggle between Native Americans and the U.S. government, it always seemed like it was a fixed deal, and that they were out to get us, and they would do anything they could to get us down, destroyed, put in jail, or killed. And there was no ethics, there was no law that would stop them from doing it. And in fact, a lot of people don't remember, but when Bill Clinton was president, he let it be known that he was going to pardon Leonard Peltier and let him out of jail. But the FBI in Washington, D.C. was so against him being pardoned that hundreds of FBI agents in Washington went to the streets, had a march, and fought against his parole or pardon by President Clinton. So as a result, literally hundreds of FBI agents went to the streets, marched down the avenue to object to him being pardoned. So Bill Clinton withdrew the pardon and didn't pardon him, based on what the FBI did in that demonstration. And in fact, because they broke their own rules about protesting against their own government, leaving their jobs, walking on the street, blocking traffic, were ground for all of them to be fired. Every single one of those FBI men who went out to protest against Leonard Peltier getting paroled should have been fired. And they, of course they weren't. What happened was Clinton caved and didn't pardon. So, yeah, when it comes to Native Americans in the U.S. government, no matter what happens and no matter what the U.S. government says, they're going to put themselves in a position higher than, better than any Indian tribe. And so the U.S. may spout its ideas about Indian sovereignty, but they don't really allow it. They don't acknowledge it. They don't honor it. Because one of the things we learned in law school is that Indian tribes legally are considered domestic dependent nations. And if you break that term down, it means they're dependent, they're not independent, they're dependent on us, on the U.S. government. So we're saying they're nations, but they're a nation subordinate to us as the U.S. and will never, ever let them be equal to us in a treaty. And even though there are hundreds of treaties in the U.S. between tribes and the U.S. government, the government has said in so many cases that they can break, the Congress can break a treaty with the U.S. American Indians at will. There's no one to make the U.S. honor a treaty with Native Americans, because the Native Americans can't make the U.S. honor it. Of course they can't. The U.S. will kill them or take away more of what they've already taken from Indians if they try that. So Indians know, even with the sovereignty that they have, that it's limited to what the U.S. will grant to them.
I have a couple of questions, because I'm currently taking the American Indians and U.S. law class. So I wanted to ask, my first question was about the Indian Relocation Act, and did you personally know any families who were a part of that?
I know some today, and in fact, the Tenderloin area of San Francisco is known for how dirty and how many drugs and how violent it is down there. Well, the Bureau of Indian Affairs building is the federal building right behind, at Civic Center of San Francisco, right behind the area where they have the waterfall, and the spring, and all the people hang out right near the BART station at Civic Center. When they moved, during the relocation period, they gave Native Americans a one-way ticket to cities like San Francisco, Chicago, New York City, and I think $500. One-way ticket and $500 to people who have been living on Indian reservations, who knew nothing about living in a city. So as a result, a lot of Indians who were moved to the city in relocation wound up becoming alcoholic because they didn't fit in, they didn't have jobs, they were very poor, they didn't speak the language, and they hung out together, and they wound up having pretty much a drunk Indian community. Even here in San Francisco 20 years ago, if you would go down near City Hall, you could see the Indians standing around drinking, because you could tell an Indian when you see one, and you see a dozen of them hanging out drinking, you know it's a bunch of Indians getting drunk in front of City Hall. So at the time, my wife and I, who's from Standing Rock, would make lunches, basically sandwiches, not booze. We would go down to where they were hanging out, there'd be a dozen of them, and we'd pass out sandwiches. And they were very, very grateful, and we thought we were doing a little good for them. And yeah, it's sad what happened, and to see that. And I know getting back to where the federal building was, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was in the Tenderloin, right there at Civic Center. So when Indians would come to town on relocation, and they said, oh, I've got a ticket to San Francisco and $500, where do I live? They'd say, go live the place around the corner, and that would be right in the heart of the Tenderloin. And so hundreds of Native Americans who moved to San Francisco, were relocated here, were sent to the Tenderloin district. And I know some that lived there, got married there, raised families there, and still live there today in the Tenderloin, because it's all they knew. And so the Tenderloin has its share of relocated Native Americans, and they're there because of the U.S. government.
My other question was, two other questions. Where in southern Louisiana are your parents from?
My dad is from an area that's no longer there. It's called the Fry Settlement. My mom is from an area called, what's that area? I can't remember. But it's the bayous were the Calcasieu Bayou was one of them, and the towns were Lake Charles, Opelousas, which Opelousas is what the tribe I belong to.
My family's from down there, that's why I asked.
Are you Indian?
No, I'm just African American and like my mom's side is like Creole. They're from,
Okay.
They're from like New Iberia and.
Oh, New Iberia. Yeah, I have family from there. Do they speak French?
My grandpa speaks Creole.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, my parents both spoke French. My dad grew up on French. In fact, my dad never learned English very well, and all of his kids went to college, and we have a family conversation over dinner or something, and somebody would say something my dad didn't like, and my dad would say something like, "You're not speaking right. You need to speak with intelligent." And we'd say, "Dad, it's not intelligent, it's intelligence." And he'd say, "Yeah, that's what I said." So, yeah, the nuances of learning English from Creole French it's very, very interesting.
Yeah. You mentioned your grandfather, or your dad didn't finish, went to 3rd grade, and my great-grandfather was the same. He only went to the 3rd grade. He was a sharecropper, and my mom was the first one to go to college, so like, she would have to like read his mailing because he didn't know how to read, but he knew how to do math, so it's just cool hearing the similarities. Like, even as paper.
Where were you born?
I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. My parents met in grad school in Anchorage, Missouri, but I grew up in Philadelphia. So it's all over. But I did go to Xavier in New Orleans for a little bit and then transferred here.
Cool.
So I've been all over that. But my other question was also about, we were talking about the relationship of Native people to the U.S. and how the U.S. is always going to put them in a subservient position. With the current case against, what's your, I guess your opinion or your thoughts on the current case with ICWA and the Supreme Court?
Right. I'm an attorney, and I specialize in the Indian Child Welfare Act.
Yeah.
I work with the city of San Francisco as an expert witness on cases involving the Indian Child Welfare Act. That's a whole long story in and of itself. You could teach a semester class about the Indian Child Welfare Act. Because what it did, the Indian Child Welfare Act put federal requirements on state courts for the removal of Indian kids. Before the Indian Child Welfare Act, states would remove kids whenever they thought they were being abused, and they did what they wanted. The judges would send them in foster care, and we all know what foster care was like. So American Indian tribes were given the right by the federal government to intervene in these custody cases, and most of the judges around the country were offended that an Indian tribe would think they had the right to come in and tell a white judge what to do about custody of a kid. So there was always a big pushback by the courts and by non-Indians to the Indian Child Welfare Act. And there is today, and like you said, there's a case going up before the Supreme Court that they're trying to do away with the Indian Child Welfare Act, take away the right of Indian people to intervene in cases. But the reason they allowed Indians involved in the first place is that whole idea of sovereignty, because Indians are considered different nations, right? Even within our nation. So to have an ethnic Indian tribe come to the non-Indian court and have a say-so in where that child should live if they're being abused or neglected does a lot to help preserve the Native American culture and the tribe. And that's what they don't want anymore. And so the effort to do away with Indian Child Welfare Act is to do that and to not allow for the continuation of Native culture or religion.
To wrap up,
Final question, maybe. I want to go along with federal Indian law and your battles basically for one of the injustices of one of the first Supreme Court Justice of California.
Oh yeah.
Serranus Hastings, right? And the original namesake of the school, and how you, along with others as well, who fought to change the school name because Hastings was one of the, it was an Indian killer, right?
Yes.
Discovered that recent 2015.
Right.
And you changed, yeah.
We all went to Hastings
Yeah.
when I was there, thinking it was a great school. We loved the name, and then we were known as the Harvard of the West because Harvard had a great law school, and Hastings followed in many of the same traditions. They made the classrooms the same way. The professors, they wanted to get really good professors here. So everybody was proud to go to Hastings. And then around 2015, one of the professors did some research and found that Serranus Hastings was not only the first Supreme Court Justice of California, he was a land grabber who hired a bunch of non-Indian cowboys to go to some Indian land in Northern California and act like marauders, clear the land, kill the Indians that were on the land that he wanted, and he became the owner of that particular land. When we found out that he was literally in charge of killing Native Americans because he wanted their land, a movement started at Hastings to do away with the name, his name as Hastings. And it only took a couple of years, and when the legislature of California found out just a couple of years ago that he was an Indian killer and there were so many people that wanted his name off, they literally voted last year to remove his name from the law school. And now Hastings Law School's new name is like the hospital, UCSF Law School. And Hastings is no more. So yeah, it's that was a good change and a good feeling, not so much of retribution, but of acknowledgement. And in fact, before they changed the name, they said, the administration said, we're going to devote some time, money, and effort and skill to help the tribe that Serranus Hastings killed. But they said that a couple years ago. Nothing has developed as a result. And I doubt that anything will.
Final words, Guillory.
The what?
Final words.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And is there something else that you want to share with us that probably going to ask?
Well, I have to say I'm lucky to have gone to this school because of the things that I told you that I experienced and helped formulate my point of view and my drive to work in the work that I do. And I think San Francisco State is known as a progressive university that helped bring about the changes of consciousness of college students and faculty around the U.S. So I think this is a great school, like Berkeley was too, known for the same kinds of activities. And I think San Francisco State, to me, will always be known for what is given to students and faculty and progressive change.
Thank you so much. Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Pat. That was so, just all of it, so inspiring. So,
Yeah.
that little mantle with your student.
Oh yeah. Well, I represented the Navajo Nation in a case on the Indian Child Welfare Act. I didn't talk about that today, but it was the first one that got national attention, and it was here in San Jose. Went to court for the Navajo Nation, had a kid sent back to the reservation, and in the liberal Bay Area, I received death threats for representing the Navajo Nation, and I got phone calls. And even attorneys that I thought were progressive say things to me like, why did you represent the Indian tribe? Why did you want that Indian child to go back to its family when it could have lived with some white people? So, yeah, the feeling of superiority of European Americans, I don't even like to call them white because that doesn't really designate where they're from. They're European Americans. This isn't Europe. Why do we speak English? Right? We're not English, and we're certainly more Native American than we are anything else. We need to acknowledge
So,
that.
Pat, you and Tom, you got your bachelor's degree, then you got your MSW, and
Yes.
then your JD?
Yes,
When did you get your JD?
1990.
Okay, so that was after you practiced being a social worker for
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
It's amazing. It's, yeah.
Also, could you, you're speaking a lot of, can I ask another question?
Sure.
This is like off the cuff. When you're talking about when you were in the psychiatric unit, a lot of, I instantly thought of like Franz Fanon and his work. Could you have like, do you think you could have like cited that in terms of how you were stating that it was due to a lot of like, what they were dealing with mentally was due to racism? Do you think if you would have like, I mean, I get obviously like they were religious, they weren't going to understand. But
You know, I didn't, at the time, I didn't focus on the racist aspect of it as much as the social aspect of it. And racism hadn't reared its ugly head. It was there, but it hadn't been addressed by people of color and what we had experienced as much then. So, yeah, it was definitely a part of what caused people of color to be in mental institutions, but it hadn't been accepted or by the non-people of color community.
Thank you so much,
Sure.
Patrick.